Somewhere in the chaos of the Second World War, a lone B-24 Liberator sat crippled on a muddy airstrip, its engines silent, its wings heavy with the memory of a mission that almost didn't end. The bomber, once a symbol of power and reach, had been reduced to a stranded giant of twisted metal and leaking oil. The men who had flown it home barely made it back alive. But the real story, the one history nearly forgot, began after the smoke cleared, when a group of ground mechanics faced an impossible challenge. How to bring that dying bird back to life with nothing more than a pile of spare parts, a busted tractor, and sheer human determination. It was late 1943. The Allies were pushing deep into Europe, and American bombers were flying relentless missions from makeshift airfields carved out of farmlands and villages. Supplies were stretched thin. Every working aircraft mattered. The B-24 seconds, known for their range and payload, were the backbone of the strategic bombing campaign. Losing one meant losing not just firepower, but the lives and morale tied to it. At one dusty base somewhere in southern Italy, a damaged Liberator limped back from a bombing run over the Balkans. One of its 4 massive Pratt & Whitney engines had taken a direct hit from flak. The propeller was warped, the mounts cracked, and the internal cylinders burned out. When the bomber finally skidded onto the strip, smoke poured from the engine housing and hydraulic fluid trailed behind like blood. The pilot cut the power and said quietly, "She's done." But the ground crew didn't see a lost cause. To them, every plane was family. These were not just machines, they were lifelines. The mechanics worked in torn uniforms, often without proper tools, scavenging anything they could find to keep the bombers flying. They'd seen engines rebuilt from wreckage, propellers hammered back into shape, and fuel tanks patched with tin and hope. But this was different. The damaged B-24 had an engine so far gone that replacement seemed impossible. The supply chain was weeks behind, and the front was moving faster than the parts. Command wanted it stripped for salvage. The mechanics, however, had another idea. Among them was a man named Corporal Joe "Red" Hanley, a quiet farm boy from Iowa with grease under his nails and a head full of strange ideas. He'd grown up fixing tractors in his father's barn, coaxing life out of machines long after they should have died. When he stood before that silent bomber, he didn't see defeat, he saw a challenge. The next morning, as the sun rose over the airfield, Joe walked into the maintenance yard, where an old tractor sat rusting behind a line of fuel drums. Its engine, though battered, still had a heartbeat. An idea sparked desperate, wild, but maybe just crazy enough to work. If he could adapt the tractor's engine, even temporarily, maybe they could power the bomber's hydraulics long enough to test repairs, move it into position, or at least keep her systems alive. The other mechanics laughed when he told them. "You can't just bolt a farm engine into a bomber," one said. "That's suicide." Joe just grinned and shrugged. "Well," he replied, "we're not flying her yet, just keeping her breathing." Within hours, he had a small team of grease-covered dreamers helping him. They hauled the tractor into the hangar, stripping it for parts under the dim light of lanterns. The air smelled of oil and determination. As wrenches clanged and sparks flew, the sound of distant bombers thundered overhead, heading east toward another mission. Time was short. The next sortie was in 2 days, and every working aircraft counted. The officers didn't approve. They called it a waste of time, an untested experiment. But Joe and his men ignored the noise. They worked through the night, sketching makeshift mounts from scrap metal, cutting cables by hand, and aligning the gears by feel. They weren't building perfection, they were building survival. By dawn, the hangar floor looked like a battlefield of parts, tractor components scattered beside aircraft wiring and panels. But in the center of it all, the B-24 loomed like a sleeping beast, half wrapped in tarps, her broken engine now fused with a hunk of farm machinery. No one knew if it would work. No one even knew if it was safe to try. But what they were about to do would become one of those small, forgotten miracles of wartime ingenuity, the kind that never made it into official reports, but lived forever in the memories of the men who witnessed it. That morning, as the sun turned the hangar doors gold, Joe stood back, wiping his hands on a rag. "Let's see if this old bird can breathe again," he muttered. The crew gathered around, hearts pounding, as he reached for the ignition wire. And in that tense silence, with every man holding his breath, the line between madness and brilliance began to blur. When Joe pulled the wire, nothing happened at first, just a hollow click, the sound of metal protesting against what it wasn't meant to do. A few of the men exchanged doubtful looks. The officers who had come to watch from a distance folded their arms, waiting for the inevitable failure. But Joe didn't flinch. He stepped closer, adjusted the fuel feed, tapped a line, and tried again. This time, a low growl rumbled through the hangar. The patched-together machine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. The sound was uneven, half farm, half flight, but it was alive. Everyone froze, staring in disbelief as the old tractor engine powered the wounded bomber's systems. The hydraulic lines quivered, the propeller jerked slightly, and gauges flickered with light for the first time in days. They'd done the impossible. Word spread quickly across the airfield. Mechanics from nearby squadrons came to see the Frankenstein bomber, as they called it. It wasn't a proper fix, far from it, but it meant the difference between scrap metal and survival. With the improvised power source, they could run the aircraft's auxiliary systems, test the hydraulics, and even maneuver the bomber enough to perform further repairs. Joe and his team didn't stop there. Once they had basic power restored, they began the delicate process of rebuilding what remained of the damaged engine. They scavenged from every corner of the base, a fuel injector from a wrecked B-17, a piston ring from a spare truck engine, and wiring salvaged from old field generators. There were no manuals for what they were doing. Every adjustment was a gamble. Every bolt they tightened could mean the difference between success and disaster. The officers eventually gave in. They might have thought Joe was insane, but the results were undeniable. The tractor rig had turned a grounded bomber into a breathing, repairable machine. It wasn't pretty, fuel lines were. Stitched together like veins, and oil dripped steadily onto the hangar floor, but the heart of the beast was beating again. As days passed, the men grew more confident. They learned to run the tractor engine in cycles, carefully maintaining pressure and watching temperature gauges like hawks. Joe even joked that the bomber was half tractor now, a farm girl with wings. The crew laughed, but deep down they felt something more profound: pride. In a war built on destruction, they had built something that lived. Outside, missions continued. Planes came and went, some never returning. Each evening, the men looked at their patched-up Liberator and wondered if she'd ever fly again. The war didn't slow down to wait for repairs, and replacement aircraft were always in short supply. But when the time came, and the command finally agreed to give it a chance, no one in the hangar slept that night. The final test was scheduled for dawn. Joe didn't say much. He just wiped his hands, checked the oil lines one more time, and gave the wing a soft pat, as if reassuring an old friend. The tractor engine was disconnected, replaced with the rebuilt aircraft motor, a creation born from scraps, sweat, and prayer. The men stood back as the pilot climbed in, flicking the ignition switches one by one. The silence stretched. Then came the cough, that rough, uncertain start every mechanic knew by heart. The engine rattled, roared, and then settled. A deep, steady hum filled the hangar. The bomber trembled under its own power again. For the first time since that disastrous mission, she was whole. The pilot throttled up, testing each engine in sequence. The rebuilt one, Joe's Miracle, held steady. It wasn't perfect. There were vibrations and leaks, but it worked. The mechanics erupted in cheers, some throwing their caps into the air, others just standing there, stunned. Against all logic, all shortages, all odds, they had turned junkyard salvage into a living machine of war. That day, the B-24 taxied out into the sunlight, its silver body streaked with oil and grime. The nose art, a faded pinup named Miss Carolina, gleamed faintly as if smiling. The bomber didn't take off right away. The test would come later. But as it rolled down the strip under its own power, the men who had built it followed on foot, walking beside it like proud fathers. Over the next few weeks, that same bomber would return to the skies. She flew missions again, not many, but enough to make her story worth telling. Pilots who flew her said she had a temper, That rebuilt engine never quite purred like the others, but it never quit either. It was said that when she took off, the ground shook just a little more than usual, as if that tractor heart was still pumping inside her. Joe Hanley never called himself a hero. To him, it was just another day's work fixing something broken because it needed to fly. But among the ground crews, his story became legend. They told it in mess halls, under flickering lights, and years later, around reunion tables. And somewhere in an old airfield record, barely legible in faded ink, there's a single line that proves it happened. It reads, B-24-214, restored to operation using auxiliary power source, tractor engine type. A single sentence for a miracle. But what happened to Joe and Miss Carolina next, how their paths ended, is the part most people never knew. The day Miss Carolina returned to the air, the entire base gathered along the runway. Mechanics, clerks, cooks, and pilots stood shoulder to shoulder, shielding their eyes against the rising sun. The bomber's patched skin gleamed in streaks of silver and black, the scars of repair visible like proud wounds. No one expected her to last long, not after everything she'd been through, but when those 4 engines came alive, including Joe's rebuilt one, the sound was like thunder rolling through the valley. The ground trembled beneath their boots. Joe stood near the hangar doors, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The pilot gave him a quick thumbs up through the cockpit glass. Then, with a slow, determined roll, Miss Carolina began to move down the runway. Her engines screamed, her nose lifted, and for a heart-stopping moment she seemed to hover between earth and sky. Then she rose. A cheer erupted across the airfield. Men shouted, waved their caps, even wept. Joe didn't cheer, he just smiled faintly, wiping his hands on his rag, whispering something no one could hear. Maybe it was a prayer, maybe just a thank you. The impossible had flown. Over the following months, the bomber carried out several missions, supply drops, reconnaissance, even a few bombing runs deep behind enemy lines. Each time she came back, Joe was waiting. He'd stand by the strip as her wheels touched down, listening for the rough rhythm of that patched-up engine. Every time he heard it, he knew she'd survived another day. But in war, miracles rarely last forever. In early 1944, during a mission over northern Yugoslavia, Miss Carolina ran into trouble again. Heavy flak tore through her left wing, and the already fragile engine Joe's creation caught fire. The crew managed to keep her aloft long enough to limp across the Adriatic. Somewhere near the coast of southern Italy, with the base in sight, they were forced to ditch. The bomber hit the shallow surf, skidding across the water before breaking apart. The crew survived, pulled from the sea by fishermen. But the aircraft, the farm-born miracle that defied the odds, was gone. When Joe heard the news, he said nothing. He simply walked out to the edge of the airfield, where the horizon met the sea, and stood there for a long time. The men around him didn't speak. They all knew what that plane had meant. It wasn't just metal. It was proof that even in the worst of times, human hands could still create something beautiful out of ruin. In the months that followed, Joe kept working, fixing whatever broke, keeping bombers flying when parts ran dry. He became a quiet legend among the crews, the man who made a Liberator breathe again with the heart of a tractor. Pilots trusted his repairs more than any manual. Mechanics sought his advice. And when the war finally ended, Joe went home to Iowa, back to the same fields and barns where he'd learned to coax life out of machines. Years later, long after the guns went silent and the bombers were scrapped or left to rust in forgotten corners of airfields, a journalist tracked him down. By then, Joe was an old man, sitting on the porch of his farmhouse, the sound of cicadas filling the evening air. When asked about the story, whether it was true that he once powered a bomber with a tractor, he laughed softly. "Well," he said, looking out across his fields, "we didn't have much choice. War breaks things faster than you can fix. Sometimes you just gotta make do with what's left, even if it's crazy." He paused, eyes distant. That plane, she was something else. Not because she flew again, but because we didn't give up on her. The journalist asked what happened to the old tractor engine. Joe smiled. "Buried her parts right under that oak," he said, nodding toward a tree near the barn. "Figured she earned her rest. Today, few people remember Miss Carolina or the farm mechanic who refused to let her die." Her name doesn't appear in any major history book. There are no statues, no medals, no grand ceremonies. Just fragments of memory passed down through veterans' families and one faded photograph found in a box of wartime relics showing a group of men in oily overalls standing proudly beside a B-24 with a tractor parked next to it. Look closely at that photo, and you can almost feel the spirit of that time, the grit, the exhaustion, the determination that kept machines and men alike running when logic said they shouldn't. The story of Joe Hanley and Miss Carolina isn't really about mechanics or engines. It's about the stubbornness of the human spirit, the belief that with enough courage, sweat, and imagination, even the broken can rise again. And somewhere, in that quiet space between memory and history, you can still hear it, the rumble of a farm engine merging with the heartbeat of a bomber, echoing through the sky one last time.